Joshua chapter 5. A couple things before, well, one thing in particular before I start on the class that I want to bring up. Tom talked about tonight our outreach efforts, and this program is many faceted, if you will, and we're only scratching the surface right now and implementing the whole plan, and Tom's going to be teaching coordinators and to teach their teams starting Sunday night, right? Sunday morning. Okay, Sunday morning classes, those that are in the coordinators are going to be in the class with him over the rest of the month of January to work on training all of us to do our parts. But in connection to that, some of the sermons that Rich and I have been doing over the last several weeks, not all of them, but some of them have been connected to the program to help us not only be motivated, but also to learn. And in connection to that, I want you to know that the next several weeks, we're working together, Rich and I, on sermons and instruction on these Bible studies. If you've seen the material table in the back, you remember if you were here for the seminar and Rob kept pulling out those books? That was so you wouldn't forget those. He kept doing that so you'd remember those books. Well, they're on our table back there for us to use to conduct studies or whatever, but it can be intimidating if you've never done that or if you don't know that type of thing. And so, starting Sunday morning, I'll give you the example. Sunday morning, I'm going to be preaching on authority. Book 1 was about authority. The first half of that book is dealing with where authority comes from, and then the second half deals with the changing of it or not changing of it and what's your response to it. So the next 2 Sundays on the morning, I'm going to preach on authority and our responsibility to authority, and on Sunday nights, Rich is going to have slides, and he's not going straight through the book, but he's going to have slides to show us how that applies and is usable in a Bible study with this type of material. So there will be no excuse for anybody to say, well, I don't know how to do that. If you're here Sunday night, you'll start learning how to do that. And so that excuse is gone unless you just say, well, I just wasn't going to be here. So plan on that. And at least the next 3 weeks, we had planned 4, but I didn't tell you this, but we may do 3 instead of 4. So pray about that, but also plan to be here for that. Okay, Joshua chapter 5. I hesitated on how I wanted to introduce our class tonight. You know that I always review, and I do want to do that, but before I do that, I want to talk about this chapter. This chapter is a hinge, if you will. This is a pivotal chapter in the history of the nation of Israel under God's Old Testament system. And yet, it is a chapter that nobody studies. And what I mean by that is not that people don't read it or that there's nothing from this chapter that ever comes out, but unless you have been through a detailed verse-by-verse study of the book of Joshua or through our chronological study, it's doubtful that you have ever sat in a class that anybody, myself included, just went to Joshua chapter 5 and taught it. In fact, it's so rare that I'll tell you something that happened. Not every preaching school, but sometimes in the preaching schools, as you're getting close to the end of your time to graduation, you get some assignment. They give you a random assignment to say, here's a text, put together a sermon on this in the next 30 minutes, and then preach it to the other students. Pretty challenging responsibility, you could expect. But to make it even more challenging, most of the time, what the guys get is an assignment of a verse that is just kind of off the wall, would never have heard a sermon on. When Creston was going through the Florida School of Preaching, this chapter was the text he got for his sermon. Actually, a very small portion of this chapter, and I'll point it out when we get to it tonight. But if it's that rare that they assign it to try to trip up a student right at the end of it, that tells you we hadn't studied it very much, doesn't it? And yet, I see so much significance in what God does in this chapter, and it tells us something about God, how He is. It talks about His mercy, even during the struggles of the nation. It talks about His grace in restoring something that had been destroyed. It talks about His promise, that His provisions continue no matter what, that God's promises are fulfilled. Now, I might not be the benefit of that promise because I walked away from it, but that doesn't mean that God's promise is going to fail, right? All right. All that comes out in this short chapter. And if you read it already leading up to this class, you probably thought one of two things. You probably thought, I don't know how he's going to cover that. And then you probably thought, we're going to be done in about 15 minutes. Right? Yeah. Okay. Now let me review and then we'll get into it. So, you know what's happened is Israel is now, they have been at the plains of Moab. Moses has died there after 40 years, and now Joshua has taken over his leadership. God and the people have challenged him to be strong and courageous. Spies have gone into the land. They have stayed at Rahab's place and been told the condition of the city, how that everybody's afraid, and they've heard all that God's done all the way back to the parting of the Red Sea 38 years earlier. They still remember all that, and so they have this fear. And then Joshua takes the people to Jordan, and they camp there for 3 days so they can see that this river is at flood stage. They pretty easily figure out there's no way any of them are going to figure out how to get across this river as a nation to go into this battle, right? Only way they're crossing is if God intervenes, and then God intervenes. But Joshua gave them specific instructions about what they're supposed to do and specific details about what God was going to do. And he said, what's going to happen is we're not following that pillar of cloud in the day and pillar of fire by night anymore. We're going to follow the ark now. And the priests are going to take the ark, and you're going to stay 3,000 feet away. And when their feet get into this flooded river, God's going to stop the river way upstream, dry up the ground, and we're going to march across. And when we march across, we're going to stop and wait. And they did. And then Joshua had 12 guys that God had told him to choose, to set aside, one from each tribe that are waiting there with him. And he tells them, now you go in the river, right there where the priests are standing, and you get some stones that you got to carry on your shoulders, because we're going to take them over where we're camping tonight. And we're going to do this for a reason. We're going to set up this as kind of an altar that's going to be a memorial. So when the next generation says, hey, what do these rocks mean? We're going to point out these are river rocks that came from that river when God stopped the water and we could get into it and get them, right? So they're going to keep passing this down. And then Joshua is the only one left over there, and he starts across, and when he starts across, he stops, and he sets up an altar in the bottom of the river that they could check at this time and see that it was still there. So all this has happened, and now they've crossed over the Jordan, and now the priests come out, and the water comes back down, and it overflows its bank because it's in flood stage. So there's no way for them to go backwards now, right? No way to turn back. Now, chapter 5 happens. Incredible significance. I hope that I can paint this picture well enough tonight for you to understand the significance of this chapter. And I have a paper tonight because I'm going to go through the first, 12 verses, I guess, and then we're going to stop and talk about something that I want to pull a whole big picture together, and then we'll finish the last part of the chapter after that. So I don't have any idea how long this will take. Maybe I will quit early. We'll see. Chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. So it was when all the kings of the Amorites who were on the west side of the Jordan and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until we had crossed over, that their heart melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the children of Israel. Now, the description that he's given of these people, he's covered the whole land. You know, they're on the what we would call the east side of Canaan at this point. They have crossed over the Jordan, but that's way over on the east side of what would be Canaan. And so, of course, you would expect the people of Jericho, that's right there, to be afraid, right? I mean, Rahab already told them about that, right? So you'd expect them to be afraid, but why these people all the way across on the other side of the land, the Canaanites that are near the sea, why are they afraid? Yeah, here's the thing. You guys, anybody that's lived here very long and has been through a hurricane, one thing that you know is the winds are bad. But if you let the water get to something, it'll destroy it, right? The power of the water is way beyond anything that the winds could ever be. That water, especially at flood stage, is a protector. As long as that nation, the Israelites, are on the east side of the Jordan River and can't get across it, that's no big deal. But now not only have they crossed it, but everybody knows how they did it. There's nobody in the land of Canaan who's saying, well, I guess they must have went upstream and threw a bunch of trees in the water and stopped it. Nobody's saying that. Everybody knows what happened. This was a visible event. Somewhere upstream where the water stopped, you think the people around that saw something significant? Yeah, and word's going to get around, isn't it? And if that river can't stop the army of Israel or Israel's God, what chance did the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and all of them, what chance do they have? None. And so, I don't care who you are. Let's deal with this from a sports aspect. I'm in a group, Facebook group with a bunch of preachers. And every year, one of them sets up a college football picking contest. It's worth nothing but bragging rights. Not that I would know, I've never won. But anyway, they select 10 or 12 games every week, and then you have to pick who's the winner is going to be, and then we add up points all year long. And one of the reasons that I haven't won, we've been doing this probably 6 or 7 years, one of the reasons that I haven't won is because I cannot pick for my team to lose, and my team loses a lot. But as much as they lose, I still think, all right, they're going to get it together this week, and they're going to be the giant killer this week, and then they're not. And so I lose the point. Okay, so you can imagine these cities, if they're going to battle, if they're truly committed, somebody there seeing what's happening and still thinking, okay, we can take them, right? Until the water dries up. Okay, we might take them, but we're not going to take God, right? And so their courage has failed. It says they're literally their heart melted. That just means they have no courage anymore, and they don't even have the spirit or the ego even to battle because of this. Verse 2. At that time the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time. Now, I'll stop there. I am going to put this together a little more than one verse at a time in just a minute. Two things I want to emphasize, and this is a part of what I'll come back to in just a minute, but two things I want to emphasize on our way through. One of them is this. They did not have knives. They have already been in battle, haven't they? And they don't even have knives. The reason I emphasize that is because this is just more evidence of the fact of as they've won these battles that they have won. Sihon and Og, who were very powerful lands, kings, leaders, and yet they didn't win because they had the best equipment, the best supplies, the best training. They won simply because of God. So let's start with that. They didn't even have knives. They got to make knives to do what they're going to do here. Second thing is, they're told to circumcise these people, and it's told a second time. Circumcise them a second time. That's an impossibility. So what is this second time? Well, the first time happened when they left Egypt. But where are those people? Those people are all dead. The second time, you'll find out in just a minute, is all these people that have been born out here in the wilderness. Now, that's going to be important when I bring all this together here in just a minute. So don't lose that thought, but let's keep moving. So Joshua made flint knives for himself and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. Now, I'll tell you something. That was the verse that Creston was given for the sermon. I have no idea what he did with it, but I don't know what I would do with that verse. But anyway, I learned something about Joshua here. Chapter 1, when he's taking over for Moses, and by the way, the only reason he's still alive is because he's had faith all along, hasn't he? I mean, all the way back at Kadesh Barnea, he was one of the two people that came back and said, we can take the land. Let's do it. God said, take it. Let's go take it. He's had that faith all along. He's done what God's asked him to do. Not saying he's perfect. I'm saying he's somebody who's going to do what God asks him to do. So in chapter 1, when God says, be strong and courageous, and Joshua accepts the challenge to be strong and courageous, and then God says, now, by the way, how many fighting men are there in the land at this time? Do you remember? Over 600,000. And now he's got to be strong and courageous. And does he say, oh, wait a second, God, that's a big job. No, this is too much. No, that's not what he does. You know what he does? He makes the knives. Keep reading. You guys are thinking I'm skipping this, but I'm not. We're going to come back. And this is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. See, we just mentioned that, right? For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people who were born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. So that's the summary I just gave you. God told them back in Egypt to be circumcised, and then they were, and then they got to Mount Sinai, and God reiterated that, and he was specific in it, and that he said the 8th day, if a male is born into this house, on the 8th day, this is what you do. And by the way, why? Well, there was a medical aspect to it, but the 8th day is because that's when you have vitamin K at the highest point of your life. But here's my question. What did it mean to God? What in the world does it mean? It is, all of that is true, but there's actually one right answer. It was a symbol of the covenant. A child was born into a Hebrew family, and this male, on the 8th day, he was circumcised as a symbol that he was in this covenant that God gave them at Mount Sinai. Okay? That's going to be important in a minute. Go back to the text. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord had sworn to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now, as this is all happening, we're being told that the reason, or that God does it because all of these people that were already prepared, already connected to this covenant, had failed. And he reaches all the way back to that event at Kadesh Barnea. I'll bring it up again in a minute, where when they came back and they said, we cannot take this land, we're going back to Egypt, and God said, okay. The consequence of that decision is 38 years more, 40 years total, you're going to wander out here in the wilderness, and all of you, except Joshua and Caleb, are going to die out here. So all the people that had the sign of the covenant already have all died. Now let's keep going. Oh, and what was the description of the land again? Okay, I want to touch on that promise of the land of milk and honey just a second. When God made a promise that the descendants of Abraham would inherit a land that flowed with milk and honey, a land that would, then they would become a nation through whom the whole world would be blessed, was he speaking of individuals or was he speaking of a nation? It was a nation. The promise wasn't specific to those people who walked out of Egypt under Moses' leadership. The promise was specific to Abraham and his descendants. So as these people died off, in order for God to keep his promise, he has to work with the next generation, doesn't he? Does that mean his promise failed? I mean, they were told. Moses told them, I'm going to take you to this land that you'll inherit that flows with milk and honey. They didn't inherit it. They didn't see it. Did God's promises fail? No. His promise was that the descendants of Abraham would inherit. The descendants of Abraham did inherit, just not those specific people that failed him. And they failed him at Kadesh Barnea. And let's keep going. So Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place, for they were uncircumcised because they had not been circumcised on the way. Now, I don't want to talk about this yet because it's going to come into this summary, but all he's told us is that after that generation had been circumcised upon the departure from Egypt, and after God gave the command to circumcise all males on the 8th day, from that point forward, it didn't happen. None of these people that were born out there had that covenant symbol. There's got to be a reason. Well, there is a reason. Verse 8. So it was when they had finished circumcising all the people that they stayed in their places in the camp till they were healed. And then the Lord said to Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of the place is called Gilgal to this day. Now, I want to talk about that just a second, and I'm almost ready to kind of bring this all to a big picture. But I want to talk about what happened. They did it. They did exactly what God told them to do in the place where God told them to do it, and they had to wait there in the place that God told them to be. And where was that place? Gilgal. Have we already heard something about Gilgal? Yes. What else have we heard?
That's where the sons were living.
Yeah. That's what I want to emphasize for just a second here. The purpose of the setting up of those stones that came up from the Jordan River was so when the next generation said, what do these stones mean to you? Then you would be able to teach them what happened. But on the other hand, they just pulled these stones out of the river. They just crossed the river. They just set up these stones. In this place, God asked them to make a covenant commitment. I want you to make an agreement with me right here. And they have standing before them this altar for them to focus on and remember what God has done. Now, let me ask you this question. If somebody asked you to enter into an agreement with them, what would you want to know? Okay? I'd want to know I could trust them. You? I mean, if I'm going to enter into agreement with somebody, I want to know I could trust them. So I'd want to know they're dependable, right? And I'd also want to know that they have the ability to handle whatever their part of that covenant is, right? Isn't that why when you go to the bank to get a mortgage or something like that, they kind of want to know what your payment history looks like, whether you're going to be able to pay them back their money, right? So before you enter into that covenant agreement with the bank's going to have to figure out whether or not you can pay that back. So Israel's being asked to enter into this covenant agreement with God, and what they have standing there is evidence that God's able to fulfill his promises, isn't he? God can hold up his end of the covenant, that God can take care of them, that God can provide for them. Any other evidence that they have in their lives that that's true? Let's keep reading. So the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. Now the manna ceased on the day after they had eaten the produce of the land, and the children of Israel no longer had manna, but they ate the food of the land of Canaan. Any other evidence that Israel has, that this generation of Israel has, that God holds up his end of the bargain? The manna. How long have they been eating it?
40 years.
A lot of these people have been eating it every single day of their life. Most of these people were born after Israel was already out there in the wilderness. And God had provided them manna the first 6 days of every week of their life. And they had seen every week of their life that it didn't keep overnight, but it'd be out there tomorrow. And they had seen every week of their life that on the sixth night, their parents were gathering up twice as much, and it did keep overnight, because tomorrow morning there wasn't going to be any out there. And they're wearing shoes that didn't wear out, and clothes that were not worn and tattered. God had taken care of them. They had eaten quail that God brought in on the winds so deep that it made them sick. They have been provided water in the wilderness. They're followed a cloud around and a pillar of fire. And when they look at these stones that represent what happened at the Jordan, everything else that led them to the Jordan is a part of that. Would they have ever been able to cross the Jordan? Did their parents cross the Jordan? If they had died with their parents in the wilderness, would they have ever crossed the Jordan? You see how all of this evidence is piling together to be on those stones, so that when God says to Joshua, now it's time to have this sign of the covenant again. You're going to be in the covenant again. And so here's what I want you to do. I want you to circumcise all of these males as a sign of the covenant, and I want you to commit that you're going to follow me. And they do it. Now I want to talk about one more thing, and then I'm going to bring that all together. Passover. Does anybody know? Well, tell me what Passover does. What did it do for them? That was one of the 3 feasts that they were supposed to have, where ultimately all the males were supposed to travel to Jerusalem to be a part of that. But tell me what it connects to.
They may have did what they were supposed to do.
Okay, that's what it connects to. You said it different than I would have, but I'll do it in a minute.
It reminds them that he rescued them as slaves.
That's what I'm getting at. It connects all the way back to when they were in Egypt. And all those plagues are happening, and the power of Egypt is being diminished, and they're seeing the weakness and the power of the Egyptian gods. And they're also seeing the stubbornness of Pharaoh, and as they're seeing God's power, they get to this 10th plague, and Moses says, now this is the last one. God says, after this, Pharaoh's going to let us go. But here's the thing. You're not ready to go yet. And so what God says is, here's what you're going to do. You're going to select the lamb, and they select it on the first day. They killed it on the 10th day. They've got all these things happening. You're going to put the blood on the doorpost and the lintel of your house. You're going to be inside the house, not outside. You're going to be inside the house, and that blood is representing something that's coming by the way in the future. But right now, Passover's looking back. And you're going to be dressed to go, because tomorrow morning God's going to lead you right out of this land. You're going to have your staff in your hand, your belt on, your garments on, your shoes on. You're not going to leave any leftovers for tomorrow, because you're not going to be here to eat them. And it happened exactly like God said, right? And then he said, now, they get to Mount Sinai, and he said, let's do this again. We're going to do this every year. We're going to do this every year. We're going to be reminded of what happened to that Passover because it's going to point forward too. And ultimately when Jesus comes and the sacrifice of Jesus is the fulfillment of all of that. But they're never supposed to forget what God did to save them. But here's the thing. That Passover at Sinai was the last one they celebrated. Now I want to try to bring all this together. So they're 2 years from the time they leave Egypt to all of that time at Sinai, to the end of that time, they're about 2 years. A big portion of that time is when God is giving them the law, the Ten Commandments, the foundation of that, then the law built upon that, and Moses is directing them. And a part of that law had to do with construction. So they're getting materials, and they're gathering materials, and they're building a tabernacle, and all of the elements, the Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, the lampstand, the altar of incense, the tabernacle itself and its fences and its courtyards, the altar, burnt offering, the wash basins, the utensils, everything. They built a huge amount of items. And how did the text tell us they did it? Not where did it came from. I'm saying, well, this is too vague. I'll just give you the answer. Huh? They did exactly what God told them to do. They're at Mount Sinai. The mountain's quaking. There's fire. There's smoke. They're afraid, and they do it exactly like God tells them to do it, right? They celebrate the Passover. They have circumcision implemented, and they leave Mount Sinai, and they travel 11 days to Kadesh Barnea, and that's where those spies go into the land. And when the spies come back, and by the way, that's Numbers chapter 14. The spies come back, and 10 of them say, we can't do this. And everybody listened to them. And the consequence of what happened there is they broke the covenant. At the end of the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and when they had done everything that God asked them to do, well, they were asked to agree to the covenant. And they said, yes, we'll do everything you tell us to do. And then they got to Kadesh Barnea, 11-day journey, and 40 days wait for the spies to come back, and they broke the covenant. Now, when they broke the covenant, what happened is they lost all the privileges of the covenant. One of the privileges of the covenant was Passover. The sign of the covenant was circumcision. They don't have either of those things from Kadesh Barnea until this day on this side of Jordan. Amos chapter 5 talks about Israel many years later. And we've already seen this. Moses talked about this, how that he told them that many years in the future, you're going to forget about God. You're going to follow idolatry. You're going to do the same things of the people of the land, and God's going to drive you away. And when he does, you're going to cry out to him, and God will bring the remnant back. You know, Moses told them all of that is coming, and I don't remember why. Oh, yeah, Amos chapter 5. I don't remember why I started that. Amos chapter 5 talks about that time, when they're headed off into captivity and why and all of that. And Amos says, he looks back to this wilderness wanderings and he says, did your ancestors offer sacrifices to God in the wilderness? And the answer was, well, yeah, they did. They did. But you know what else they did? They lost their faith. And they followed the practices of the Egyptians. Why is it that they built a golden calf? Of all the things they could have built, why did they build a golden calf? It's what they saw in Egypt. They carried Egypt with them. And as a consequence of that, they broke the covenant. And when you break the covenant of God, you lose the benefits of that. You lose the privileges of that. What they did not lose was the promise that God made, not to the individual people, but to the nation. As he kept feeding them every day and kept guiding them and kept protecting them, not for their sake, but for what was coming with the Messiah. But the covenant has been broken. And when it's broken, well, you don't get the benefit of it anymore. And I'm going to make application before I finish putting that all together. It's no different today. Somebody becomes a Christian. Tom offered the invitation. That whole thing was called Offer the Invitation. But at the end of it, he offered the invitation for somebody to be baptized into Christ, contacting the blood of Jesus, having their sins washed away, and being saved. That's a covenant. That's me saying to God, I am dead to self. I only need you. And God's side of it is, I'll wash away your sins and save you. My humility, God's power. That's a covenant. Is God going to fail? Nope. He's going to hold up his end. But what if I walk away? I told a story before class. I was talking to Patrick and Jean about something that reminded me of an old story. When we were young, that's a long time ago, I was preaching for a church in Jacksonville, Arkansas. And if my memory serves me right, we had been there about a year. It might have even been longer than a year. And Terry was teaching some of the kids' classes or something like that. Maybe she was just taking the kids to class. I think she was teaching. And somebody came, a lady came and brought a couple of kids to the class, and she greeted them and said, "Oh, it's good to meet you. My name's Terry Frizzell. My husband's the preacher. Are you new to our area? Are you visiting?" And the lady got offended because she was a member. And this was not a big church, and we'd never seen her before. She thought. Now, here's the point I'm making. Just because I have been dipped in water does not mean I have held up the covenant. It means I have entered into it, if I've done it the way God's asked me to do it. But I still have a responsibility to remain faithful to him in my life, right? That's why that's always on my slides on Sunday morning, right there at the end. It doesn't end at the baptistry. That's a birth. It's a life, a covenant life. You want to add something before I pull this in?
Passover, remember they said they fasted to celebrate the Passover, you have to be circumcised.
That's where I'm going next.
It was just one little.
That's where I'm going next. When they lost, Psalm 78, by the way, talks about this as well, if you want to pull it in. When they lost the covenant, they couldn't be symbolically in the covenant. When they lost the symbol of circumcision, they lost the privilege of the Passover. They had participated in the salvation that happened on the 10th plague in Egypt, and they lost it. All because they wouldn't walk into the land. God said, "Follow me, and I'll hold up my end." And they said, "No, we don't think you can do it." You know. Now, here's what happens. Hold your thought just one second. Here's what happens. The next generation, when God turns to them and says, "Now, practice circumcision, and then celebrate the Passover," and the man is going to cease, they have crossed into the land already. And the river has come back, and they're not going backwards. They did agree to enter into the covenant. So God said, now, the symbol and the privileges are reinstated. And then he says, and now, all that merciful provision that I had to provide for this nation that's died out here because they failed in the covenant, you don't need anymore. Now, does that mean God quit taking care of them? No. It meant he showed them that this land flowing with milk and honey was going to be the blessing that was going to take care of them from him.
You had said that no matter what we do, God's promises still
Yes.
come.
Yes.
And so it's in essence, those 40 years allowed God to, or at this point, the nation, it was almost like a restoration.
Yes. Yes. And that's what I want to apply it as. Before I'm not going to quit early, by the way. Still got a few more verses. If you thought that, sorry. The parallel today is type, antitype, is the church. God has predestined that the church will be saved. That's his promise. You know what? The church will be saved. If, on the other hand, I forsake the covenant and leave the church, me as an individual will be lost. And God's promise will still be fulfilled. So I have a commitment to the covenant. You see that? Is this an empty chapter? Let's read the last part of it. It came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood beside him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" So he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord I have now come." And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and worshipped, and said to him, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And then the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take your sandals off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." And Joshua did so. Now, I want to read the whole thing together to say this first. This is God. This is the angel of the Lord that is in the presence of Joshua here. And I know that it's not just an angel. It's the angel of the Lord, which is the second personality of the Godhead, pre-incarnate Christ. I know that because no angel was ever willing to accept worship. Not only that, no angel ever could proclaim his presence being holy, yet God can. God's the only one that can accept worship. And also, it's the same statement that was made when this whole scenario started with Moses at the burning bush when God told him to take his shoes off there, wasn't it? So Joshua sees something and he doesn't know that this isn't just some soldier. And so he goes up and just says, are you on our side or on their side? I can imagine that would be a very tense moment, wouldn't you? And then he is revealed as the angel of the Lord who is going to fight this battle for them, and Joshua worships him. All of that can't happen until they get into the covenant. Till this generation says, we're going to follow you. We're going to do what you ask us to do, and then God shows up. See, that's the thing. When the manna ceased, the God who brought the manna didn't leave. When the pillar of fire and pillar of cloud stopped, the God who brought the pillar of fire and cloud didn't leave. When the waters flowed back down, the God who blocked the waters didn't leave. I'm trying to apply it to our lives today. All of us have blessings in our lives. But if the blessings aren't what we want, or even if we're in a moment where they're no longer there, that does not mean the God who provided them has left us. And that's what we think. You know, I can't tell you how many times in my life I've heard somebody, a loved one has died, and they've said, I don't know why God has forsaken me or left me or something like that. God didn't leave you just because your blessing left. Something may have changed in your life, but that doesn't mean God left. That's what the devil wants us to believe. These people didn't believe that. They believed God was there, and when God showed up, Joshua worshiped him. I love that chapter, don't you? Don't know how I'd have written a sermon in 30 minutes on that verse, but I might could do it on the whole chapter maybe. Okay, comments, questions? Yes.
What is it that God told Joshua all the time?
Be strong and courageous?
Yeah, well, this guy with the sword
Yeah,
just walks right up to him, so
Yeah.
he's practicing.
yeah. And it's he's a leader.
Yes.
He's got to be responsible to do that. Yep. All right, anything else? Okay, let's close with a prayer. Father, we're so thankful for the privilege of being in your presence tonight, and we're thankful, Father, for your word. We're thankful, Father, for this record that we've studied tonight to help us to understand your power, to help us to know your blessings, your promises and faithfulness in those promises, but also, Father, the sobering reminder of our commitment to your covenant. Help us, Father, always to remain faithful to you, to depend upon you and not ourselves. Forgive us where we fail you. In Christ's name, amen.